Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Autumn, and I'm one of the co-founders of the American Ivy Association. We appreciate all of you taking the time today to join us. This is the rescheduled webinar for the basics of Ivy clinic ownership. Chase Howard, an attorney with the Florida Healthcare Law Firm in Delray Beach, Florida, will be leading this webinar. And we have a special guest today, Ron Epstein, who basically is someone who connects healthcare providers and businesses with lenders and has helps create optimal lending situations. So he is going to support Chase on this webinar and take questions on business, financing, and some of those aspects. And it looks like we do have the ability for questions today, but we may not get to all of them. So feel free to submit them. If we don't answer your question during the webinar, we'll address it afterwards and email you to follow up. But I'm going to let Chase take it away. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Autumn. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for being here. A special thank you to Ron for being here as well and kind of supporting us on this. As Autumn mentioned, I think the chat box is open. If you want to throw some questions in there, we'll do our best to answer some of those questions. If we can't answer them now, we'll certainly make sure that maybe we can get like an email around to everybody and answer those questions, maybe a special kind of FAQ that Ron and I can do after this, just to make sure that as many questions get answered as possible. So the focus of today is the basics of Ivy clinic ownership, what you need to know about owning an Ivy clinic. It'll touch on some things that you may be aware of, some things that you might not be aware of. And then we had some attendee questions that were dropped in prior to this, I guess, emailed through. And so we're going to try to touch on some of those as well. But really, this is a basics course, right? What do you need to know? Who are some of the people that you might need to get in touch with? One of those being a guy like Ron. There's a lot of different, industry partners in the IV space that could help you as you start your clinic, whether you've got knowledge in healthcare businesses or no knowledge. There's a lot of things you need to know. Healthcare in general is a very highly regulated, high liability industry, and it is that way because it could be highly lucrative as well, right? So the powers that be across states and federal government, want to ensure that patient safety is always number one. The delivery of services is done for patient need. And to the extent that nefarious actors can be weeded out, I think that's the goal. So although there's certainly money to be made in a clinic like an IV hydration clinic, there's also a lot more to it than simply opening doors, hiring an RN, and having them place an IV line, or being an RN and doing that, right? You're in a alternative healthcare space. There's a lot of different rules and regulations that apply, and that happens because it is alternative. It's not a hospital where there's specific statutes in each state that say here's how hospitals have to run, for example. So the goal today is just get some basic info out, answer some deeper questions, have interaction here with Ron, and to the extent we can, answer some additional questions that might come through from the attendees. With that, a little bit about myself. My name is Chase Howard. As Autumn mentioned, I am an attorney with the Florida Healthcare Law Firm. The firm is based in Delray Beach. I'm based in Tampa. We've got a few lawyers over here. We work with all types of healthcare providers and practices. I work with a lot of medical spas, as that term is used. And that includes not only aesthetics, but also the wellness industry, which includes IV hydration clinics and companies. I work with and speak to a lot of training academies, product reps, device companies, not only on clinic ownership, regulatory issues, operations, But our goal is to really be a lawyer that understands how these clinics operate and how they're different from those traditional healthcare practices, where there's a blueprint for how they're run and operated, right? These are generally new types of clinics. IVs have been around for a long time, but the way they're being, delivered now is different than they were being delivered, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And with that comes, new challenges in, the growth and legal aspect of this industry. So what are IV clinics? Definition. There really isn't a definition in state law, right? Some states actually might have some, and in fact, Texas does have a definition more specifically for medical spas. But not every state is going to specifically define an IV clinic. Why? Because, one, the way they're being used now are a little bit different and newer than how others in the past might have used it. There's, I think a lot of different services or treatments that could be included in these types of clinics. And so, to say, define IV clinics as one specific thing, I think is a hard thing to do. In general, it's a clinic though where, services are being rendered via intravenous, right? IV only. That could include simply saline bags. It could include, compounded products and medications. It could be brick and mortar. It could be mobile. It could be, only at spot events and things like that. And so to simply define it as one thing, I think is really difficult at this point for any state law. But in general, it's a medical clinic that provides IV services and treatments. What types of services are provided? In most cases, IV clinics, I think, are standalone in that they provide, IV only. There's a lot of spas and clinics out there that add on IV services to the other offerings. And, that's still a clinic that provides IV, and there's still laws and rules and regulations that apply to them in that case. But as I mentioned, it could just be saline. It could be compounded medications. We've seen, all sorts of different service offerings, via intravenous. So if there's an IV involved, it's, IV clinic, it's going to fall into most of the regulatory issues that we'll, kind of touch on today. And then the governing bodies, this is largely dependent upon the providers that are placing lines, right? And it depends on the state. So it could be a state board of health or division of health. It could be a state board of medicine. It could be a state board of nursing. If there's a separate board for your physician assistants, if there's a separate board for advanced practice versus registered nurses. And then to the extent that, EMTs or paramedics are able to in your state provide IV in a non-emergency setting, that could be Department of Health, Division of Health, or it could be its own separate body. And then on top of that, there's the Board of Pharmacy. If you've got a clinic that is, compounding and you fall under compounding laws and there's not an exemption for you, then that's where sometimes the Board of Pharmacy could come into play and be the, regulator on sterility and cleanliness and compounding and how you operate. From a federal standpoint, most of the issues that would apply to a traditional practice on a federal standpoint aren't happening here. And so that's why they're kicked back to all these state boards, and why my answer is really, it depends on the state, but there's usually a handful of boards and bodies that are involved here for oversight, regulation, and then enforcement. Who can own IV clinics? This is largely dependent upon your state as well. There's a doctrine out there called the corporate practice of medicine. Every state talks about the corporate practice of medicine. Some states prohibit the corporate practice of medicine, which means they prohibit non-licensees or even non-physicians from owning a clinic, healthcare medical clinic. Other states do allow it without restrictions. Other states allow it with certain licensure. So, before you dive into it, really be aware of what your state allows based on if you're a licensed person or not. Some states allow registered nurses to own a medical clinic. Other states say that you have to be a physician to own one, and that's it. Or there's some sort of weird combination. California, for example, 51% has to be owned by a physician. So it's dependent upon that, but there's restrictions on who can own an IV clinic. Again, these are medical clinics. I don't necessarily say healthcare. I try not to, because healthcare could encompass, dental as well, or other things. And we want to just really focus on this being practice of medicine. And then state licensure. In addition to who can own it based on the corporate practice of medicine, state licenses, right? What state licenses do you need? Well, first and foremost, your providers, the ones that are, placing the IV, are going to need, license in that state, right? To practice medicine or nursing or whatever it may be. Next to that, some states have state licenses for medical clinics or healthcare clinics, as they may call them, and group them largely together. Florida, for example, does not have a state license for a medical clinic or a IV clinic specifically. I believe Texas has its own laws and statutes specifically for, quote, med spas, which would include IV clinics, and they may have a state license for that. So in addition to understanding who can own, there's also, if you can own, then, what else do you need to know? What else do you need to have as far as state licenses go? And this might be a good spot to, reintroduce Ron before we kind of continue on here. Ron, in addition to understanding, I think, the laws of a state for owning and operating an IV clinic, one of the biggest hurdles I see with clients is, how do they start it from a financial standpoint, right? What type of money are they looking at for startup? Where do they find this money? Can they just go to a traditional bank? Can they go to a traditional bank's healthcare practice lender? Where do you come in? Where do you see initial startup costs coming in, and where do you see banks lending, and for what? For IV clinics as they pass these two first hurdles of can they even own it?
Okay, appreciate it, Chase. Well, the most important thing is whether you're going to put an IV clinic within an existing business that you may have or a startup. Two types of financing are usually available. Number one, SBA guaranteed financing, which is usually used for a startup and is available if the credit is good. What we're looking at most of the time, makes a difference who the lender is. We're looking at least a credit score that's in the 650 to 670 range and above. And a lot depends on how much money is needed for a clinic. We finance clinics that are where people in existing clinics may only require $50,000 or $100,000 or something in that range. That requires one type of financing. To people that put up brick and mortar or rent space and put in a very large IV therapy clinic, we usually have financing available for that. What we require on all of these, obviously, is a business plan and 2 years of projections. So we can finance anywhere between $25,000 and up to $5 million, which I don't think is required in this particular situation. So I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that may come up regarding financing. We work both with banks and traditional non-lenders as well. We find, Chase, that most banks today, for whatever the reason is, don't want to really think outside the box. And unless someone has a very, very good relationship with the bank, it would be very difficult for them to go there. The bank is usually going to require some type of backup to the financing, and we can usually get away without that. Again, depending on the credit score, the business plan, and the 2-year projections to show the ability to service the debt.
That's great. And, in your experience, Ron, do you find that, startup costs are, that there's an appetite for startup costs for a clinic like this, or is it a little bit of a larger, barrier than a maybe traditional, healthcare clinic? Does it help? And second to that, does it help to have a licensed professional being an owner, or is that really not a concern for the lenders?
That's a great question, Chase. It always is a lot easier if there is a licensed owner for this type of situation. Although we have been doing this with either practical nurses, registered nurses, as you know, also an IV therapy clinic also requires some type of IV technician that has credentials as well. So, it all depends. We can finance from startups to just an existing clinic that wants to take on an IV therapy as well.
Do you find that's interesting. Do you find that it's better to have these staff members, providers engaged or employed, contracted in some way prior to applying for lending, or can you have maybe an owner or not an owner and say, hey, here's the plan, here's what we're looking to do. We haven't hired anybody yet, and still qualify? Does having a team in place make it easier, or is that a requirement?
Well, obviously, a team in place makes it easier, but it's not a requirement, no. As long as the business plan makes sense and the projections make sense, it makes it a lot easier for us to be able to finance such a situation.
Sure. Now, would someone like you and your team assist with producing business plans or helping clients understand what needs to go into those to show a favorable?
Absolutely. We have a format that we can send to prospective people that are interested in an IV clinic and show them what goes into a business plan, and also send them an Excel spreadsheet that shows what is needed on the projections. Usually projections are month to month for the first year and annually on the second year. And it gives all of the headings that we need to look at, from gross revenue down to what all of the subtractions are to get to the gross profit. We don't expect that on a monthly basis, but we want to show that we have the ability to service the debt, including in what we can provide for financing, and including working capital to put on top of that.
That's great. And I guess maybe my last question would be, what's a typical time frame? What's a good time frame for a client to start a process like this? Just to ensure that they've got funding when they need it, either at startup or a couple months down the road, things like that.
No, that's a great question. Typically, from the time that we start to work with a prospective client, we will send out an email with a list of what we would require to look at. Once they can fulfill that list, which is not that difficult, we then, within 5 working days, will get back to them and let them know whether they are qualified to move forward. And that qualification is usually based on their credit score and what what their financial statement looks like, et cetera, et cetera. At that point, we will send out another list of what we would require, including the business plan and projections. And when that's fulfilled, I would say within a 3 to 4 week period, we should be able to get an approval with one of the many, many, many lenders we work with across the country. And at that point, probably another 3 to 4 weeks before we can expect a closing date and funding. And of course, Chase, a lot depends if they're going to rent space and there's going to be some construction and renovations involved. That, of course, requires permits, and permits, as you know, require a little more time.
Absolutely. Yep. Especially in South Florida, things can get delayed, and you're lucky if your contractor shows up, after a few days. So, delays, plan for them, plan ahead and plan accordingly for the process of applying if that's the route you're going and need. I think, this is not a type of business or clinic that is going to get opened overnight. One, the funding aspect of it, two, we're going to get into some of the potential licenses and things like that. Three, staffing it is, can be very difficult as well. So, I think, for any new owner out there, my best word of advice is plan. As you heard from Ron, when there's, financing involved, a well thought out and drafted business plan is certainly really important and key. And I think that goes for, pretty much all aspects of the new clinic. So, thank you for that, Ron. Ron will obviously still be here. Maybe I'll have a few more questions for him, or if he has anything to share closer to the end, he'll jump in. But again, the chat is open if there's any questions or follow-ups for Ron. To get back into licensure, I talked a little bit about state licensure. Providers is kind of the number one thing. Understanding who can perform the service and the treatment is I think the first big threshold to operating an IV clinic. And that goes with not just placing the IV, but also supervision of the person placing the IV. And then if you get into compounding, then who can compound, who qualifies for certain state or 503A exemption for compounding. So it is sometimes as simple as you've just got one person, they're going to place an IV and you're good to go. But depending upon what you're doing, a lot more things and hurdles could come into play. Primarily with provider licensure. And then next is, facility licensure. So again, I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of states that, may have a specific clinic licensure. Again, Florida's not one of them. There's other states that do have it, other states that don't have it, or some combination thereof. But, one thing that's unique to some states is, a license for IV clinics or IV providers to go into patients' homes or to operate outside of a brick and mortar location where they're mobile. And since, mobile services have become, very, very popular over the years, regulation and enforcement on, appropriate licensure for mobile clinics, has become a big question for clients of ours. One issue here in Florida specifically, as it pertains to mobile services, is that there's a specific license called a home health agency license. And really that license is for skilled nursing. And the unique thing about it, though, is that the statutes that govern it also include in there IV hydration therapy. So, it's not a traditional, skilled nursing service, home health agency nursing services, in-home nursing service, that's being provided. But the lawyers who wrote that law, wanted to include IV services. So we've got a kind of unique issue here in Florida where we've got clients who want to operate mobile IV clinics, go into patients' homes, and in a lot of cases, they need to have this really comprehensive license for providing in-home services. It's a big process. It's an expensive process, and it just doesn't seem to kind of go with the nature of the IV mobile clinic. But nonetheless, it's something that's there, and clients need to be aware of and decide if they either A, fit with any of the really strict and slim exemptions, or B, maybe aren't doing it exactly, how the statute states. So that's something to be aware of. And then generally in every city and county, there's some sort of business license, not a specific healthcare license, but a business tax receipt, a license to do business in that city or in that county. Really, it's just an annual tax on any, business there, registering that you're a business, you're doing business there and operating in that city and in that county. So those are some things to be aware of. And then lastly, on a state level, like I said before, make sure your state, if it has a specific license for medical clinics or IV clinics or med spas, if you fall under that, you're going to need to get that, whether it's through Department of Health or Board of Medicine or something like that. You're going to want to make sure that you're fully compliant with all those licenses, because the hurdle you'll run into is fines, but also enforcement that shuts you down, and then now you're not operating. So back to the point earlier, due diligence, couple months of planning, seeking out the actual licenses you need based on the specific services you're offering and how you're offering them will really save you a lot of time, money, and headaches. And then I want to hit you guys with just some common questions, that we get, and some light answers. And I say light because, again, 50 states, 50 different sets of laws. Then you've got some federal laws that kind of, throw in there. And then you've got some non-state laws, but really, independent governance that comes into play as well. First big thing is, medical directors. Well, then we'll actually start with that last question. What is the difference between a medical director and supervising physician? Well, in the med spa IV clinic space, the term medical director is thrown around a lot as far as physicians that a clinic hires and uses to deliver services, provide supervision, order supplies, prescribe. And really, in most cases, there's not a difference between the term medical director and supervising physician. In some states, there are specific definitions of a medical director for certain types of licensed facilities. In my experience, I have found that a lot of those licensed facilities don't apply to these IV clinics, and those are licensed for different reasons, and they use the term medical director for a physician who's hired by the clinic and has really specific duties and responsibilities. A lot of the time, supervising physician is really the more appropriate term, because it kind of defines what that physician's doing. They're supervising a mid-level provider, an NP, PA, RN who's delivering IV. But really, what's the difference? Let's not necessarily look at the difference, but let's look at what they do. They, again, provide some level of supervision. Maybe they provide standing orders. They provide a license to order supplies, maybe a license to prescribe. Maybe they're even compounding. So I would say, in general, do you need either of those for your clinic? Again, I don't know the laws of all 50 states, but my guess is that in general, you're going to need a physician involved in one capacity or another. State by state, it's different, but most cases, a physician's going to need to be involved. In some cases, there's laws for autonomous nurse practitioners, and those nurse practitioners can generally operate without a supervising physician. Now, the issue you could run into, and we see it here in Florida, is that sometimes those laws are restricted to certain areas of practice or specialty. And also sometimes third parties, vendors, insurance companies, which don't really come into play here, but in some cases they do. Third parties might still look at an autonomous nurse practitioner and say, you need to have a physician involved. And maybe to Ron's point too, a lender might say, great, you've got an autonomous nurse practitioner, but do you have a physician, on board as well? So, you need some level of physician, and maybe in some cases just a autonomous nurse practitioner. But difference between medical director and supervising physician, term of art, and really depends on if your state statutes say that they're defined in one way or another. A similar question about medical directors or supervising physicians is hiring one. I thought this was an interesting question, but hiring a physician who lives in one state but might be licensed in another state, say it's your state where you operate. Can you use them as your, quote, medical director or supervising physician? I don't know. Again, it depends on your state laws. In some cases, that certainly is appropriate. That physician's licensed there. They're licensed to practice medicine there. They're licensed to supervise there. Generally, as long as they're complying with any nuances of supervision and or prescribing, then I don't see, big issues with that. Something to clear, obviously based on your specific scenario and your state laws. But generally, that's a possibility for someone to be licensed in multiple states and serve clients and clinics in multiple states. Let's see, compounding. So, a lot of our clients do enter the world of, compounding their own bags. And, sometimes you can order from certain pharmacies or have it compounded elsewhere. Sometimes you're compounding yourself. In general, we're talking about 503A pharmacy, and there's a specific exemption under 503A, which basically says that if compounding is performed by a licensed physician and done pursuant to an individualized patient prescription, then you're exempt from 503A pharmacy, regulations. It also provides some sort of small exemption for, compounding in limited quantities, right? For physicians as well, basically, kind of just to have a small stash on hand. That physician can compound a drug in advance of receiving prescriptions, right? They might know that they're using the same product over and over again and create a small amount at a time, use that, and then, do it again for another small amount, or do it one by one. These exemptions, don't necessarily extend to, they really don't extend to, mid-levels or physician extenders. So this 503A compounding exemption is really strict as it pertains to the compounding in an office, by a physician. If you're outside of that exemption, then generally you're going to need to comply with, FDA and the State Board of Pharmacy compounding laws. And then the last thing is that I want to kind of touch on is USP 797. So USP 797 applies to all facilities that prepare sterile compounded drugs, but not those that are in response to manufacturer directions for reconstitution. I'm not going to get really deep into this because there's hundreds of pages of guidance on USP 797. And that's really what it is, right? USP 797 is, a non-governmental, body. It's really a scientific organization that got together and said, we need to have some standards for sterile compounding and pharmacy actions, essentially. There's not an enforcement body with USP 797. That's really left to state boards. But generally, states and those state boards look to USP 797 as kind of the guidelines for sterile compounding in all settings, right? So that definition of who USP 797 applies to includes physicians, right? So it includes physician offices, it includes IV clinics, right? Anywhere where you're compounding sterile or preparing sterile compounded drugs. There is an exemption under USP 797 for immediate use, just like there is kind of with that 503A pharmacy exemption. Basically, it says that no special facilities are needed if that compounded medication or compounded product is administered within 1 hour of compounding and avoids touch contamination. The office and facility still needs to have some sort of clean and aseptic techniques in place, but you don't need to go through the rest of the 797 guidelines, which really focuses on, sterility, clean rooms, and garbing, right? Those are kind of the big three issues with 797. They want to make sure that the facility that is compounding products and medications operates in a very clean way. And they put in place, recommendations and guidelines for, sterile hoods, certain levels of garb, meaning clothing, hair, hands, coats, etc. And then cleanup procedures. And it's basically, policies and procedures for your clinic to follow through with. USP 797 and that organization, they do even state that, a lot of their language is, kind of left open for interpretation, meaning it's not the Bible, it's not the specific strict guidelines, but it's what's widely recognized and accepted as here's how you should operate your facility if you are compounding. So again, hundreds of pages of guidance on what's appropriate and what's not. If you don't fall under those exemptions, then you're likely falling under the kind of purview of, the boards that enforce USP 797. And I would certainly suggest that you dive into that a little bit deeper with a lawyer, someone who knows it, and make sure that you are either complying 100% or as best you can, or to the best of your ability that you're comfortable with, and that is required, if at all. So with that, I think we're going to push up on time here. I know Ron's here for a few more minutes, as am I. If anybody has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. And if we can't get to everything, then we'll certainly, send a follow-up around with FAQs and things like that. Ron, anything you want to add while we're here for the next maybe minute or two?
No, the only thing that I wanted you to touch on was someone that's on a startup of operating as a sole proprietor, as opposed to forming some type of corporation for a lot of different reasons that you're aware of.
Yeah, I think it's important to have a conversation about corporate structure when you're going to open and operate a new IV clinic for a number of reasons. One, liability. That's probably the biggest one.
Right.
And then two, tax purposes. I'm not going to talk about tax because I'm not a tax professional, but I can tell you from my own experience, there's probably quite a few, tax advantages to owning a company versus not owning a company and operating in that way. From a liability standpoint, again, while every state has different laws on this, and in general, there's going to be, better protections for the owners of these clinics. Should they operate under an LLC structure per se, or a corporation, or even a professional association or corporation, rather than operating just as an individual sole proprietor. So benefits to it, absolutely. A lot of different options, a lot of good options, some less good options. But really, I think going down the route of having a corporate entity to operate a clinic like this is certainly, the right way to go. And does that have any impact on lending, whether you have one or not?
No, not necessarily, Chase. I would be more concerned if I was starting up to limit the liability, as you pointed out. And, from a tax standpoint, that's something that everyone has to figure out according to their own tax situation.
Mm-hmm.
No, the only other thing that I'd like to just tell everybody is I'd be more than happy if they either call me or email me. I'd be more than happy to send them an outline showing what we want to see in a business plan, and also an Excel spreadsheet to show 2 years of projections. And if they need any help, I will be more than happy to get on the phone with them and guide them through it so that we can come up with the best business plan possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Ron, what we'll do is we'll make sure we got everyone's we send everyone your info as well, so if they have follow-up questions, they can get in touch with you.
Right.
And you know, with over 30 years of experience in this field and in this industry, and working with healthcare clinics and providers and lenders, you certainly have a wide breadth of knowledge here. So great resource for everyone in attendance. To speak with Ron, always available, really nice guy, and that's certainly why he's on here today. So we'll make sure we share around his info as well if anyone has follow-up questions.
All right, I would be more than happy to answer any questions that anyone may have now, either now or certainly later at your convenience.
Sure. I don't see any coming through right now, so we're going to
Okay.
get this wrapped up.
Great.
And if anything comes through, of course, everyone will get Ron's info. My info is up here if you have follow-up questions. But thank you, everybody, for being here, for attending. We appreciate it. We wish you best of luck on your journeys, either as current or new or future owners of an IV clinic around the country. So best to you all. Happy New Year.
All right.
And we look forward to the next webinar.
Thanks for
Thank you
doing a
all.
great job. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Y'all
All
take
right.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye.